Arwen, we have to start with your name. I mean, you're writing sci-fi, fantasy, young adult, this sort of stuff, and your name is Arwen. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, now it sort of seems like fighting gravity, like it was always meant to be, I suppose. But my parents were huge Tolkien fans, obviously. Our family is of a Celtic background, but when people ask me about that, I like to say that Arwen is a Celtic name, but my parents didn't know that or care. They really just named me from the Lord of the Rings. And it's kind of funny because if I had been a boy, apparently my name was going to be Matthew. So it wasn't entirely Tolkien themed, their child naming ideas, but they just liked Arwen, I guess.
So you don't have a brother named Aragorn or Legolas?
I don't, and I only have one sister, and her name is Alexandra. So I think which is a common name, but one I really like, but clearly not Tolkien.
Well, at least you both have the same first initials.
That's right, it's important.
Now, you just had a new book come out in February, Seeker. And why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Give me the elevator pitch.
All right, so the elevator pitch is, I call Seeker a heroic family tale that goes terribly wrong. It's set in the near future in Hong Kong and Scotland, in a world that kind of blends a lot of elements of the past into its future setting. So it has a little bit of a timeless feel. And it's really the story of several teenagers who are raised on this remote estate in Scotland. And they've been kept isolated from the rest of the world for most of their lives. And they've gone through a pretty brutal training program since they were quite small. And in this program, they're taught to fight and to use some fairly unusual weapons. And this is all to become a seeker. And as far as they know, a seeker is someone who uses this esoteric knowledge they've gradually been taught and these skills to do good things. They probably compare being a seeker to something like being a Knight Templar from the Middle Ages who's pledged himself to doing good. But they are being lied to, and far from this noble calling, they've actually been manipulated by the adults around them for years, and now, as their training is coming to an end, they're being used. And they're really being forced to do some pretty awful things as the story gets started. And at that point, things get kind of fast and intense as they try to escape from this life and discover who they've been trusting, who's actually an enemy, and how to find a path for themselves into the future.
So I guess this would fall pretty squarely then into the sci-fi genre rather than, say, fantasy.
Well, it's funny. It's marketed as an epic fantasy, and it's an interesting backdrop to the story because things are revealed rather slowly, and it's going to take to book 2 and to book 3 before we understand sort of the origins of their technology, if you will, or their secret knowledge. So I think in a funny way, it appears to span both fantasy and sci-fi, but maybe by the end of the series, it will be a little more in one camp than the other.
Gotcha. Well, as long as your default explanation for everything isn't a wizard did it.
Definitely not.
Now, this is not your first book, of course, but it is your first young adult book, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Well, so what were you writing prior to this, and why did you decide to write a young adult book, and how has the experience differed? I guess that's 3 questions in one there.
I'm gonna parse those. The book I wrote before this was called Resurrection. It was definitely more straight sci-fi with an adult audience. And that book is sort of an ancient Egyptian mystery with people from other planets essentially coming here to rescue lost technology for the fate of 3 worlds, including Earth. So, it has sort of a cult following, that book. But the heroine of that was maybe, not young adult exactly, but fairly young. So I've always sort of written around the age group of young adult. I think for this book, it's more about the coming of age years in these teens' lives, so it fit in young adult. But honestly, I don't think other than that, there wasn't much I did to write it differently. It just really is the age of the protagonists.
So it was more the story that led you in that direction rather than a conscious decision to shift from adult fiction to young adult fiction.
There was a time early in the process because when I first saw the story, I could imagine it more like part of the story with them as adults and part of it exploring what had made them the way they were, which would be the time period that ended up being this book. So I did see it as a possibility between two different time periods, one with adults, one with teens, but the drama was really all when they were younger, so very quickly that became the focus of the book.
Yeah, that's the most basic rule of storytelling, isn't it? Is focus on whatever stretch of time where the most interesting things are happening.
That's right. I think the best editing advice I ever heard was make the cool stuff happen closer together.
Yeah, drop the boring bits. Isn't that like what Robert McKee advises when in his book Story, which is how do you decide when to start a book or a screenplay or something like that? And the answer is as close as possible to the moment when your main character's life begins to change. And I've always found that to be helpful advice.
Absolutely. And sometimes those are the parts I feel like you can jump right into as a writer. You know, it's because those are the moments that are most interesting. And then if you have to explain more, you always can. But I find like, what part do I most look forward to writing? And I try to move the book there as quickly as possible.
Well, it's a balancing act, isn't it? Especially with sci-fi fantasy, where you want to tell the story as efficiently as possible, but you have to balance that with the demands of having to also sort of explore the invented world or establish the rules of an invented world without also just falling in the trap of info dumping 3,000 years of history on your reader.
Absolutely. I think for this book, because even though it's only a little bit in the future, these families are, you know, many generations old, hundreds and hundreds of years, or if not 1,000 years old. They can trace back their lineage quite easily. Info dump I was always guarding against that, or figuring out how to trickle it out in a fashion that sort of was in pace with what was interesting in the story. So hopefully the reader was always a moment, you know, there was always that moment of like, I just want to know. And then I would hopefully provide that at that time. You know, you never know if you succeed, but obviously you try.
Now you mentioned that Seeker is first book of a trilogy. So do you have the next book written, and do you have the whole trilogy already plotted out? Do you know how it's going to end?
I do know how it's going to end, at least in broad strokes. The second book is written, at least the first full draft that I was willing to turn into my editor is written, but in pretty good shape. And the third book is outlined in very general terms, but with a lot of you know, specific moments, but that's still fairly general for how detailed the outline will eventually be.
So fans won't have to wait another 6 years for the next book.
Gosh, I hope not. I hope as soon as I get that editorial letter back, I'll be nose to the grindstone to get number 2 out there.
Boy, there's nothing quite like those letters, is there?
You're sort of like, you know, teeth biting fingernails, but still you want it. You can't wait for it, but then, you know.
Yeah, I know. It's that thing where on one hand you're terrified to know what people think is wrong with your book, but on the other hand you're delighted on the chance to make it better.
I find there's just sort of an emotional progression, which is just the sort of dread and then anger and disappointment, you know, but then you just wait, you know, those will go away, and then you'll start getting excited about all of the great things for the next draft.
Is it like the stages of grief, you know, the 6 stages of editing?
There's definitely denial in there somewhere, like that you're so wrong. And then if you give it 24, 48 hours, maybe they're not wrong. Maybe there's something amazing in those notes.
And whenever people ask me, how do you know you're done with editing? It's easy. When you start changing things back to what they already were. Then you're done.
It's really good.
Now, we talked about this a little bit in person, but you feel, and I agree with this as well, that outlining is important, but you also don't want to outline too much, right? Yes,
I find I have outlined too much. In fact, for part of Seeker, I think I got, or rather for part of the sequel to Seeker, I got into that trap a little bit, where you outline in such detail that you sort of suck the life out of the moment when you're writing. So I try to dial it back from there, but I often will have, you know, every chapter with several notes of what will happen. I try just not to get to the point of exact dialogue, obviously, or exact actions, but keep it broad enough that there's still spontaneity when I write.
I didn't get to hear all of this. You were talking with Rachel Hartman when we managed to grab some lunch after our event. Late lunch, I suppose, and early dinner, brunch.
Some might say dinner.
There was food on the table. Let's put it that way.
Right.
And you were
Good food.
you were talking to Rachel a little bit about some of the science that inspired the books or went into the books, and all I caught was something about string theory. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, years ago, I read, I've always been into popular physics, at least. I wouldn't call myself an incredibly scientific mind, but at least a popular work on physics I can make my way through and understand, most of. And years ago, I fell in love with The Elegant Universe, the book by Brian Greene, which really is an overview of all physics through, from the very earliest physicists to what's happening now. And his sections on string theory were particularly intriguing to me, whether string theory ends up panning out in its current form or becomes something else. The idea of really an unknown number of dimensions curled up at every point in space that we are technically passing through all the time, was sort of the fascinating kernel of part of the technological aspects of Seeker. And this is not necessarily explored in the first book. These teenagers find themselves introduced to certain artifacts that are clearly unusual and have some unusual qualities and unusual abilities to vibrate in ways that alter the fabric of space around them in some ways. It's explained a little bit more in the book, but clearly this is not, word for word based on string theory, more inspired by the idea of if you were stuck in a time a few hundred years ago and had some way to access these hidden dimensions, what might that look like, and what would the artifact that allowed that access look like?
Well, given your interest in that, and given that you have enjoyed some of Neal Stephenson's writing, I actually would double down on my recommendation of, assuming I'm pronouncing it correctly, his book Anathema, which one of the cool ideas, without spoiling anything, is that there are these groups of people in his social structure, in this alternate science that he creates, who can essentially manipulate reality because they have learned to sort of tap into the multiverse around us and choose a path through the multiverse that gets them the result that they want to get, whether that's, having a dinosaur show up in a parking lot or something else. It's really kind of a cool way of essentially having magic without completely breaking the idea of science.
I love that. It's definitely weighing down one end of my bookshelf right now, so I'll get that out and put it a little closer.
His books do tend to do that. So, since you're writing science fiction, and it seems like you do love it, who are some of the authors who inspired you and that you fell in love with when you started on this whole journey of being a reader and a writer?
Well, as a kid, I definitely grew up on the sort of golden age of science fiction writers, from Asimov, then to Ray Bradbury, Kurt Vonnegut, of course, Frank Herbert. Maybe Dune was my first real introduction to science fiction. Yeah, I was there when you bought it. It's a beautiful copy. And then since then, I've gotten really into historical fiction as well. So I feel like what I'm inspired by a little bit is a combination of the feeling of historical fiction with a more sci-fi or fantasy direction for the overall story.
You've done quite a bit of professional writing before moving into the book world. You were writing screenplays before writing books. Am I correct?
Well, I would say actually a little before and a little in between. My first job was writing for this foundation in Los Angeles that produced PBS shows. So I did both print and some TV writing for them. Then I wrote 2 novels, and one of which was Resurrection. The other was called Sovereign's Hold and was sort of the specialty fantasy book that was with a little press. Then after those, I had 3 kids, and during that time wrote numerous screenplays, several of which were bought or, none of which were made. And then as my kids were finally back in school, I thought, I really love writing books, and it's what I've wanted to do since I was a kid. So that was when Seeker was born.
Do you think that writing screenplays helped teach you anything about story pacing or even prose, although prose style is not as important with screenplays as it is with books?
I think that the pacing and quick character development were absolutely things I learned from writing screenplays. Especially pacing and how to devise a story to sort of remove the excess and tell the core story. You don't have to remove all the excess in a book. Sometimes the extra details are what make it wonderful, but keeping the core of the story moving along and very clear was definitely something I got better at writing screenplays.
Do you find that one is easier to write than the other? In my experience, even though physically screenplays are much shorter, sometimes constructing the story still takes almost as much work as constructing the story for a book, because it does still need to be a solid structure.
I think the outlining part is probably the same for me, the same length of time, and the research would be the same, sometimes more for a screenplay, because the screenplays I wrote were more likely to be set now. So and they weren't necessarily just slice of life, so they might require some specialized research. But the writing, I think, is much shorter for a screenplay, even though you may go over it more times, it's just shorter. But I agree that the planning part is not really any shorter.
Did you ever have any trouble switching in and out of that present tense, going back to the novels?
It is different to think that you can just describe what's happening as pretty much as long as you want. It is very different. But so when I sat down to write Seeker, it definitely took a little while to click into that. But once, of course, I'm still reading voraciously every day, so it's not like I've completely lost touch with the written word like many in Hollywood probably have.
So if Seeker gets adapted into a movie, will we get to see you write the screenplay?
Well, it is being adapted, and I did not want to write the screenplay because I'm still writing the other two books, and I thought that would be a very difficult balance to manage, because you can't help when you write the screenplay want to simplify and clarify things, which you have to do. But if I were then trying to go back and make changes to my plans in the books, which then might reinflate. It just seemed like a rabbit hole I would never get out of. So Columbia has a very talented screenwriter who's on the job, and I look forward to seeing what she does. For
fans who are interested, where can they go to find out news about your books, possible movie adaptations, everything else that's going on? I have a website, arwendayton.com. which I try to keep updated with any news like that, any press links. And also I try to have a somewhat interesting blog, often about sort of the research process and photos from research trips and things like that. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And on Instagram, again, I did a fair amount of traveling and research for Seeker, so I trickle out some, I hope, interesting videos and photos from those research trips with a little explanation of how they relate to the book. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure, and I'm sure we'll cross paths at Comic-Con or at some other event at some point. Absolutely. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this interview. Thank you for having me. My pleasure. And again, I recommend everyone go check out your Twitter feed and your website, and of course, your books. Thank you, Christopher.